British 1950s paperbacks of science fiction. I'd like to give a short recital about my lifelong involvement in collecting and researching British science fiction paperbacks of the post-war decade. Now then, it all started when I was 5 years old and I started school. And on starting school, I soon discovered that nearly every boy that I know was into comics. And so I was soon introduced to show you what was popular in Britain in the late 40s and early 50s were American science fiction comics with superheroes. Captain Marvel was preeminent, and here we see a few Captain Marvel covers. The Captain Marvel has recently been revived as Shazam as a film, so a lot of people will be familiar with that. But Captain Marvel started in the 1940s. Here we see some typical Captain Marvel stories with his arch enemy, Dr. Savannah, the evil mad scientist. And the stories were written by a science fiction author called Otto Binder. And they were notable because they were full of humour and very light-hearted. They were tremendously popular. I'm sure because of the new film Shazam, people are familiar with the saga of Captain Marvel. But there we are. Now, as well as Captain Marvel, the other popular superhero was Superman. The American superhero was the first superhero. He started before Captain Marvel in the late 30s. Captain Marvel started about 1940. And everyone is familiar with Superman through the films and TV series. And there we see the tremendous success in America and in England of Superman. Is the origin story of Superman as a baby. It's an evacuee from the exploding planet Krypton. Everyone knows that story. Now then, these American superheroes, the comics were reprinted in British editions in England, and they were the ones which my school friends were collecting. So I soon got absorbed in the hobby. Now there was some British superheroes, so obviously competition. And the most blatant imitation of Captain Marvel was Marvel Man. And here we see some of the Marvel Man covers, which are straight rip-offs of Captain Marvel. Sixpence. All the comics in the late 40s, early 50s was generally priced sixpence. Okay, so it was all comics, and I loved them. But the thing was that I was unaware of the tradition of written science fiction, books, novels. I didn't know paperbacks existed. It seems incredible, but a lot of people didn't know. A lot of boys were unaware of what we call proper books. We fed our imaginations on comic strips. And the next development in Britain was the advent of a new boys comic called The Eagle, which came out early in 1950. And the lead story in The Eagle weekly comic was Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future. And that was a tremendous success. The first issue sold over 900,000 copies, and it was an instant success. And a large part of the Eagle comic success was down to Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, who was brilliantly drawn and written by a man called Frank Hampson, with his team of assistants working under his close supervision. So the first Venus story was a collaborative effort, but was essentially created and directed by the amazing Frank Hampson. And it became the best-selling comic in Britain, and I was with it from the first issue, and I absolutely loved Dan Dare, with exciting interplanetary storylines, aliens, sinister treants. So every boy became a great fan of Dan Dare and the Eagle. You can see from the colourful artwork here that it was absolutely fabulous to the post-war generation. There's the advent of the famous Mekon. Now Dan Dare was so successful that he quickly spawned a radio series on Radio Luxembourg, which was sponsored by Horlicks, the famous nighttime medicinal drink. They sponsored it, and it was a weekly serial, 15-minute episodes, 7:15, Monday to Friday. And it had been running for some time, but there's the Horlicks sponsors handbook, which they issued. And it's interesting to note that the main scriptwriter was Geoffrey Webb. Now, Geoffrey Webb was famous as the co-creator of the BBC radio series Dick Barton, Special Agent. And in fact, here we see that the main actor who played Dan Dare was in fact Noel Johnson. His sidekick was played by the same actor who had been Dick Barton's sidekick, Snowy White. And he played Digby. And there was five seasons of the serial. They ran over 500 episodes. Now then, I was inspired to create my own comic strips because I was obsessed with comic strips. As I listened to the radio serial, I devised my own comic books based on the radio serial. And they're all coloured with crayons initially, and ink, and writing and drawing every night, taking shorthand notes. As soon as I'd heard the 15-minute episode, I was able to transcribe the entire story fairly faithfully, with snatches of actual dialogue, which I was able to make notes of. And here we see in my youthful enthusiasm, there's the Mekon, everybody recognised. I was able to transcribe these radio serials. Now I did that just for my own enjoyment and own entertainment. I had no idea at the time that these little albums of mine would have any significance. But the fact was that the Radio Luxembourg series was recorded on a master tape, and after the series finished, this tape was lost or destroyed. So of the over 500 episodes, there was no recordings existed. So the whole Dan Dare radio saga ran for several years in the early 50s, was just disappeared. But my own comic book transcripts were in fact the only existing record of what the stories were about. So I managed to interest a few magazines, such as the Dan Day Tribute magazine, Spaceship Away, into, I wrote articles telling them explaining what the serials had been all about. And my synopsis I was writing there was based on my one comic strips. And one of the pages of one of my stories I had transcribed by a professional artist and a professional colourist, Ron Turner and Tim Booth. But that was my original script. With obviously the drawings were much better than mine. So I've done a series of articles about the Dan Day Radio Luxembourg episodes. And if you Google Dan Day Radio Luxembourg on the Google, you'll find there's a few little podcasts about my comic strips and what the stories were about. Now then, that's just the background. The real point of this little series of talks I want to give about British science fiction paperbacks. The point was that I was only aware of science fiction and what I enjoyed through the medium of comic strips. I had no idea that paperback novels, hardback novels, science fiction. In fact, I didn't even know the word science fiction. I just knew I enjoyed fantastic stories. And when I discovered written science fiction, it was to change my life. How I became aware of written science fiction was entirely due to my best friend of those days, was a lad called Ian Dick, who lived beside me in David Street in Wallsend on Tyneside. Ian was a year older than me, and he was sort of my comics mentor. And we used to endlessly discuss and swap comics and discuss the stories. Then one day, one glorious Saturday, Ian told me that he'd made a discovery. He'd been spending the weekend with his grandfather, and his grandfather had shown him what he called science fiction paperbacks. And I couldn't believe what Ian told me when he described one of the stories which his grandfather let him read that weekend. It was just pure fantastic adventure, obviously of the genre science fiction, of which I was unaware of that there was a label science fiction. And he described this exciting book to me about a man who was able to see into the future and see the scenes of his own death, and how he desperately tried to change his behaviour to prevent his death coming about. And I later on discovered that this book, which I didn't find until many years later, was in fact called 0 Hour by Vargo Stanton. You cut?
No, I just continue. Right.
No, yeah, okay. It's still on me. 0 Hour by Vargo Stanton. Now, Ian told me his grandfather had said that he'd got all his science fiction books from a second-hand bookstore in Wallsend called Joseph Storm Bookseller, who was in a downtown area just off Carville Road, a run-down ancient area of Wallsend where frankly I hadn't ventured before. But apparently this fabulous bookshop provided all these science fiction paperbacks. So I hurried down, followed Ian's directions as to where the shop was, and located this shop on Benton Road, just off Carville Road in Wallsend, and I entered the dingy premises of Joseph Storm Bookseller. Now, Joseph Storm was a morose-looking individual, rather shabbily dressed, with a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, and behind him were cupboard shelves with piles of paperback books. And I asked Joe, "Have you got any science fiction paperbacks, please?" rather hopefully. And to my surprise, he produced a pile of books from which I made my initial selections. And these were the books that were to change my life. There was A Thing of the Past by Volstead Gridban, The Dust Destroyer, the S is a publisher's mistake, it's Destroyer, The Dust Destroyer by Vargo Staton, and The Resurrected Man by E.C.Tubb. Now the system of the bookseller was that the books were costed me a shilling each, and I got sixpence if I returned them for exchange. But of course, once I discovered these books, I never did take any back. I kept them all. Now here we see my three choices. It was largely determined because the word science fiction were on the cover of all of them. I looked at the books and I chose those three. When I got home, I discovered, scrap that. When I got home, I studied the covers of my reckless purchases. The Thing of the Past had the most splendidly lurid picture. It showed a man and a scantily clad girl confronting a fearsome dinosaur. I immediately selected this for my initial reading. The Dust Destroyer showed two men in spacesuits standing on the outside of a spaceship in orbit above the Earth. The Resurrected Man had the most restrained cover of the three, showing a group of tiny spacesuited figures jetting through space towards the spaceship's airlock. And that was the order in which I read the books, beginning with The Thing of the Past. To say that I read the book is something of an understatement. I devoured it, because this was real science fiction and completely eclipsed all the flim-flam juvenilia of the comic strips, which now seemed utterly childish in comparison. Having discovered written science fiction, and in particular science fiction paperbacks, I then determined that I would complete my collection of them and investigate where all these books had come from, and why in particular they seemed to have dried up on the bookstores, because I checked, after I'd read a couple of the books, I checked the current bookstores and they didn't seem to be in evidence again. All the ones I'd seen so far had been second-hand. So I determined to investigate further. My investigations would actually last for several decades, in which time I would amass a complete collection of all the post-war British science fiction paperbacks to 1956. This will be the subject of future videos, in which I hope to show you some of the more interesting covers and tell you the background stories to their authors.